Me first, Al?
I can hear you, Bill.
Oh, yeah, because I'm using my old laptop for this, and I didn't have the Zoom set up on until this morning. So let me
Okay,
mute this, please.
good to kind of
That's
see
why the
you.
video's not working, because it's kind of I got to work on it.
Okay. Anyway, welcome everyone. I'm delighted to be here for a really special evening. This is sort of the middle of three kind of historical retrospectives that we're having. And this one is about the founding of Mayhew, like how this organization came together, how that happened. Bill, if you could mute yourself, I think right now it's just your name is on the screen.
No, actually, I tried muting it, Al, and it's not muted.
Okay, sorry. Okay, Monica, are we okay? Okay. I was the executive director for 10 years, and I'm honored to be a trustee emeritus, which means when they ask me to do something like this, I do it. And I'm thrilled to do this. And we're gonna be back on March 11th to talk about that first summer, how that went. I am joined tonight by four legends of Mayhew history, and I will mention who they are, and then we're going to turn things over to them in turn. First one is Sam Chauncey, who was there at the creation. He was in the room where it happened, as they say. And Sam has a lot of credentials in the outside world, like a big university administrator at Yale and president of a hospital. But within Mayhew, Sam is best known because his name is on the wall. He was the coach of the Snake League softball champions in 1956 and 57, the Sandwiches. I'm also, we know this, Sam. We are then joined by Jon Choate. Jon was the first director of Mayhew, and this is kind of a special night. I don't know if this counts as all being in the same room, but for the second time in history, we have the four living directors of Mayhew all in one room. We do see you, Roger LaRochelle, and we see you and wish you a happy birthday, Jim Newt. Jon had a long career as a math professor, a math teacher at Groton School. And again, he was there leading the organization in the first Mayhew summer. Vin Broderick recently retired after 23 years as the director of Camp Pasquani. Many of you know Pasquani and the Groton School Camp and the Groton School were our godfathers, were Mayhew's godfathers. And Vin has done a lot of research in talking about, in looking into Pasquani's role. The people who were principals for Pasquani back then are no longer here, but Vin, who was a boy at Pasquani at the time, knows the history really well. And also Dick Beyer, who is kind of has done it all at both Pasquani and at Mayhew. He's been a trustee at both organizations and a longtime treasurer at Camp Pasquani, and he can add some color in talking about some of the people involved. There is nothing preordained about Mayhew. It was an island that was kind of abandoned. Two organizations got together and they did a remarkable job thanks to some bravery, some pragmatism, some idealism, and some courage and foresight and vision. And I'm gonna turn things over to Sam Chauncey, who, Sam, Mayhew was, the Groton School Camp was in your blood, and you've been associated with Mayhew for so many years, I'm afraid to tell you, but I think it's like 71 or something like that. Since 1950, from New Haven, Connecticut, Sam Chauncey.
Thank you, Al. But it can't be 71 because I'm only 60 years old. But Mayhew is, I'm or the island and Mayhew and Groton School Camp are in my blood. My grandfather worked there, and I'm unsure of the exact year, but he graduated from Groton in 1891. And he was devoted to the rector, the headmaster of Groton, Endicott Peabody, who was the one who founded the camp. And so if my grandfather worked there, it was probably in the early 1890s. And he often talked to me of working there, and he loved it. And of course, at that time, the camp was on Groton Island on Squam Lake. And as I recall, it moved to Newfound Lake in 1921 or thereabouts. I went to work there as a counselor in 1950. I was only 15 years old, but I was, I guess, taller and heavier than most 15-year-olds. And so they let me be a counselor, even though I was a little younger than most. When I was at the Groton School Camp, just to give you some ideas, the island, of course, had no electricity and no running water. There were no power boats of any kind. I have a vivid memory of beloved Jack Richards every day rowing across the lake to take the mail and go into town and buy the groceries and so on. We had 3 successive 2-week terms in the summer, and we had 50 boys each term. The first term had 50 boys from the Boston area, the second 50 from New York, and the third 50 more from Boston. I think we gave up the New York kids at some point. They were a hard group to work with, and we were not really qualified to do it. I remember vividly that the year that after Howard Lincoln, who I'll speak about in a minute, had a heart attack, and he was there, but I was more or less running the island. The budget was $10,000 for the entire summer. So it was a very different place, but the goals were surprisingly similar in terms of bringing young kids there who were disadvantaged or at risk, and giving them an opportunity to see the world through a different set of lenses. I want to say a word about Howard Lincoln. I don't know how long Link was the director of the camp, but I would guess 25 to 30 years, but I'm not sure. He was a school teacher. When I last knew him, he was teaching in Billerica, Massachusetts. Link could be gruff in a way, but underneath it, he was one of the kindest men that ever lived. And I know that everything I've learned about being fair to other human beings came from Link. And he taught me a lot about human nature and about people. And working at the camp for him was a family matter. His beloved and wonderful wife, Florrie, was there every summer, and his son, David, who I know is on here tonight, was often there when he could. And Link devoted himself way beyond what his very modest salary would have justified. And he could get more out of $1 than anyone I knew. I remember once going to Shackett's with him, and we had to, I don't know, buy 50 pounds of hamburger. And his negotiation with Mr. Shackett, the senior Mr. Shackett, over 50 pounds of hamburger was a sight to behold. But at any rate, he got it at about 1/3 cost. Jack and Wendy Richards. Jack was there when I was there. We were both students at Groton at the same time. And then Jack continued his association, and he and Wendy were there. And I think they ran the camp one summer. I'm a little fuzzy on it. And while I was there, Jon Choate, when he was a Groton student, was a counselor, and that, I guess, was his first association. And his wonderful career with the camp afterwards is something to behold. But what makes me happiest of all is that when Bill Polk, the headmaster of Groton, told me that The school was going to give up the camp so that it could focus its attention with young people in the area where the school is located in Massachusetts. I talked with him long and hard about my hope that the island would remain as a place where young people could be worked with in some form or fashion. And he and the trustees of Groton School very generously did ultimately turn the island and its assets over to Mayhew. It's one of the most important segments of my lifetime, and working with Howard Lincoln was particularly important for me. So that's my story, and I'll turn it over to Jonathan, who knows a lot more than I do.
John?
I don't think he's unmuted.
There we go. Everyone hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, I don't know where to begin. I think I spent it was 2 summers at the camp and just loved it. And it really made an impact on me in terms of getting into education. A name which hasn't come up yet, and I hope it does again, is Paul Avery, who I think when I was there was running the camp and probably would have kept running it for many, many years. Unfortunately died. I got to know Paul really well. He's a very kind man. I was a prefect in his dormitory. And he taught me a lot about camps, just watching him and how he got things going. When I was in college, I didn't go back to the camp. I actually worked at another camp, and that was Agassiz Village, which was a camp up on Thompson Lake in Maine. And again, it was a camp that didn't necessarily work with underprivileged kids, but had a real mix. And it was run by an Arthur Miller, who was a professor at Boston University. And that gave me another look at what camps could be. Didn't really get involved with the camp until I became the first director. The way that came about was, to pick up on what Sam was talking about, when Groton School gave up the camp, what happened at Groton was it became a home for an Upward Bound program. It was run by Frank White. And I sort of worked indirectly with him in an indirect way during the year. And what that taught me was how important it would be that if we were to do something with a camp, that wasn't just a one-shot, one summer deal. That's really important that there be some follow-up. I guess the next piece, I started teaching at Groton in '66. I took a sabbatical in '68 to go to Bowdoin and get my master's degree, which in some ways was a good thing, in some ways is a bad thing, as I'll explain in a minute. It was at Bowdoin. In fact, I can remember the night that Charlie Stanwood came in, and somehow he'd heard that I might be interested in getting involved and doing something. And he and I had a great conversation. And it was then when I realized how wonderful the Pasquani group was and how they were going to support everything that was going to happen. I'll tell more about the first year, but I said, yeah, I'd love to do it. I didn't have a clue. I had a clue what I was getting into. How was I going to get kids? Where were they from? And I talked to some people, and it became very clear that it really should be something in New Hampshire, that this was could be a really good program for underprivileged kids in the state of New Hampshire. Didn't have any contacts. I can remember walking the streets of Manchester, trying to get kids to come. I had some really helpful from a local politician I can't remember his name now, but he was terrific. And that's kind of where it started. The island had sat dormant, I think, for 3 years, I guess. And there's no electricity, no running water. And that's where we started.
Now, John, we don't want to give away the March 11th first year story. So we don't want to get too much into what happened on that first summer. How did you, but did you, maybe the thing to do right now, I don't mean to interrupt you, but maybe have Vin Broderick talk a little bit about this whole Pasquani interaction that you were talking about. Does that make sense to you, John?
Yeah. Can I just put in, I think I should put in one more thing.
Sure.
I'll explain later why I only lasted a year. And I think it's an interesting story. So.
You okay waiting on that?
Yeah, I will.
Okay.
I will tell that later.
Okay, great. Thank you, John. Thank you, Sam. Vin Broderick. Vin, tell us, how did these different forces come together from these two very different institutions?
Well, I want to interject a couple of things here on the closing, because as John said, Groton had decided to focus on the Upward Bound program at Groton, but he also mentioned no running water, no electricity. And reading between the lines of things that I was looking into, it sounded as if the state of New Hampshire had also ratcheted up its expectations for camps. And it was going to take a big infusion of funds to bring the island up to what the state was expecting. I also want to say that John, when different people went around looking to find out who this first director should be, John was the unanimous guy as being the perfect choice, and so he came into it. Charlie Stanwood was the director of Pasquani at the time, and he said that at this time in history, and this is the spring of 1968, and many of us can remember how turbulent that time is, probably especially Sam, with first Martin Luther King's death in his assassination in April, and at the time of his assassination, Dr. King was putting together the Poor People's March in Washington, and Mr. Charlie went before our Board of Trustees and said that at this time in American history, especially, we as summer camps need to be more concerned about what he called the disadvantaged American, and the need to reach out to people who don't have a lot of opportunities and to provide more. And he said that summer camps have a unique opportunity that way. And all of us that know summer camps know that there are ways in which people get to know each other there, and that people can learn. And I think you see this especially at Mayhew, in a way they can't necessarily in schools. They don't have to worry about academics. They can just be dealing with the personal traits. And Mr. Charlie, as much as anybody, was committed to seeing that happen in a broader way. And so when he heard that John, as John mentioned, he went to Bowdoin to talk to him about the possibility of his taking over because of John's previous experience. And Paul Aubrey I believe John was at the time was the chaplain at Groton, and recommended John for the position, and recommended that Charlie Stanwood and Ted Church, who were looking into the possibility of Mayhew Island as a site, because all the buildings were out there and this location would be ideal on the island. And they went to talk to Paul Aubrey at Groton about the possibility that this could be the site. The board got behind his efforts, and after the meeting with Paul, let me see if I can come up with those, the three things that came out of the meeting that Ted Church had with Paul about this. Mayhew Island could possibly be bought for its assessed value from Groton School. And at that time, it was assessed at between 200, what is now 200,000, 250,000 in current dollars. Second thing is they could obtain, another option would be to obtain a 99-year lease at $1 a year, which Groton was generously offering for it because this seemed to be right down the mission of the Groton school camp. And that it was on the condition that the acquisition by the Pasquani Trust was conditioned upon the fact that a camp for underprivileged children be established and continued during the term of the lease. And that was in a meeting from August 6, 1968. And the board very much got behind it. At the time, Sam was the president of the Groton School Camp Association. And so Paul put the Pasquani folks in touch with Sam, and Sam came on as a champion for Mayhew right from the start. And he talked to the other board members of the Groton School Camp and explained what the mission was. Now, one thing that is important to keep in mind about this founding time is that Sam was the assistant to President Kingman Brewster at Yale. And so in 1968, 1969, 1970, we all know what turmoil there was about the war in Vietnam, about, even now we're still focusing on civil rights. And all of these things were coming to a head. And on top of that, Sam was in charge of minority recruiting at Yale and was doing a lot of outreach work there. But then the board in the fall of, and Sam, you correct me if I'm wrong on these dates, but in the fall of 68, the board at Yale decided to go co-ed.
That's right.
And to admit women for the following fall. So this meant that all these preparations had to be made beforehand. So while Mayhew's getting going, Sam is being torn by these crucial, very important issues, national issues, but focused specifically at Yale. And at the same time, though, he is making it possible for Mayhew to open up on the island, so that is the first joining of people. And when the boards were discussing this, it was decided that 3 members of the first Mayhew board would be Pasquani trustees, and 2 members would be the Groton School Camp. And a big factor was going to be raising funds, but the state, because of the mission of Mayhew, granted special permission that in a way, Mayhew that first summer with 10 boys, and John was helped by the Model Cities program in Manchester of recruiting 10 kids. I believe, John, all from Manchester, unless I'm wrong there. And those kids came, but they were seen basically as a camping expedition of Camp Pasquani, because only on a camping expedition would you be allowed to have no running water, no electricity. And fortunately, but that meant for the second summer, there would have to be, those things would have to be installed. And Paul Aubrey at Groton did some research. I mean, he was also getting behind this, as John mentioned earlier. And he was doing some research on what the costs would be. And just to put a power line, the estimate he was given by the power company was the equivalent of what would now be $100,000. And that was without any of the other things that the power line was expected to run. So all these things were going on. There had to be a lease negotiated, but I think everybody was flexible enough that that there would be, without the lease, that Mayhew could still run. And it wasn't until a couple of years in that there had to be a formal lease, and that came to a head because there had to be somebody local who was already designated, and that had to be Charlie Stanwood. If, as happened, there was a fire in one of the buildings, and he had to be able to speak for the repairs. But it was an incredible team effort to make all this happen in quite a short period of time. And I may have other things to plug in later, but that is the first steps.
Wow. So Sam and Jon, you want to chip in with observations about Vinny's narrative?
Well, I will say one thing, that Ted Church's name has been mentioned, and Ted Church was a very distinguished lawyer in New York City. And he was a graduate of Yale. And, I have to say, I loved him dearly, but he drove me crazy because he complained about everything the Yale administration was doing every day of the week, as long as he could possibly do it. But somehow we maintained our friendship, and it was astounding that the two of us who had done battle for so many years should discover that we were working on a joint project. And I think, in fact, it brought us closer together as friends. But Ted was quite a character.
And so Ted was known to Sam well ahead of the Mayhew connection.
Jon, Dick Beyer, you want to jump in, Jon?
Yeah. Remember that first summer we had no running water. We had no electricity. I had a wife who was pregnant. I had a 2-year-old daughter. And God love Cindy Choate for putting up with it. She was amazing. And she was super. So put that in terms of moving on to this island, starting something that's set dormant. I was thinking, what the hell am I doing? And to be honest, it was the backing of the Pasquaney people and other people like Sam that said, wait a sec, this could be something really big. And they, in a way, allowed me to dream sort of big, as I'll say during the next session. So well, a little bit later, just a quick explanation of why I stopped. November 29th of what would have been 68. My wife went in the hospital, and the baby was going to arrive, and I'm sitting in the waiting room, and the nurse comes out and says, Mr. Choate, your wife would like to talk to you. Well, I open the door, and then my wife Cindy looks at me and says, Choate, you're not going to believe this. And there's the doctor holding Choate baby A, baby B. We had no idea. So all of a sudden, this is a whole nother factor in my life. So anyways, I just, hats off to her for what she put up with. She was very instrumental in that first summer, so.
Thank you, Jon. Dick, we haven't heard from you. You know a lot of these characters, including Ted Church and others. You want to weigh in? Dick, if you're speaking, you're muted.
Yep, you're right. Sorry. But I said I knew all 5 of the original trustees of Mayhew, mostly through Pasquaney, but of course I got to know Jack through Mayhew for many years, and met Sam once or twice too. But just a few comments. I think the real spark for Mayhew and getting the idea going really was Charlie Stanwood. And I came to Pasquaney in 1954. Still involved in 3 committees. I'm not on the board, Al, but
Oh, you are? Oh, sorry.
Charlie Stanwood was somewhat of a god to us in the 50s. as a mentor and somebody we really respected and looked up to. And I recall his motivation for Mayhew being rooted in wanting to bring scholarship kids to Pasquaney originally. And he had tried a program with St. Andrew's School, which didn't really work real well. I remember that happening while I was there. The kids would come up for a week, which wasn't near enough time.
St. Andrew's Camp. St. Andrew's
St.
Camp,
Andrew's
part,
Camp.
part of Choate School.
Oh, okay. And I think Choate was probably part of the motivation as well, because I think he wasn't totally satisfied with the Choate scholarship programs, and he liked the idea of having a camp where kids could get their feet on the ground and grow up and learn camping, and thought that would make it easier for them to come into a camp like Pasquaney. And we have had, ever since the beginning, we've had Mayhew kids at Pasquaney. But as to Owen, Ted, I can tell a lot of stories about Ted, but I'll tell you one. Ted was a very good friend of Mr. Charlie, but he was a practical joker who liked to have fun with Mr. Charlie when he was there. There are many stories that I remember, but one was a letter arrived from the Indian Affairs on fancy stationery from Park Avenue, New York, Indian Affairs Council, saying that they discovered, I think it was, they came up with a wild name, somebody, Wilbur Arbuthnot or something like that, had discovered that Pasquaney is probably a great site for archaeological work. And meantime, he came up to camp. Mr. Charlie had put the letter aside for a board meeting and not done anything with it. But suddenly arrowheads started showing up around the camp in various places. The kids would discover and bring them up. And he finally got onto it, but he had an address with his secretary in New York where they were supposed to send information on the Indian side of it. But anyway, he had a lot of fun, and we all enjoyed Ted when he came up to camp because we knew he was going to be up to things.
Now,
Father-
Dick and Vin, the five, and Sam, the five original trustees were you, Sam, and Jack Richards from the Groton School Camp Association side,
Right.
Owen Lindsay, Ted Church,
Yes, and Father Jon Choate,
Father Jon Choate.
a classics professor at Wesleyan. I don't
And
know
Dean
whether you was
faculty. for
there with
25
you, Vin?
What?
Was he there when
Yeah,
you
we
were there?
overlapped. It's interesting because Jack Richards was my dean of students when Mayhew started, when I was in high school. And Jon Choate was the recently retired dean of faculty at Wesleyan when I was a student there.
Al, I'd like to go back just to one other thought about Howard Lincoln. At the camp, and I think Jon Choate will remember this when he was a counselor, after the boys had been put to bed, we would meet in the dining room for what was called faculty supper. And that would be peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. But we had one radio, and Link would almost always be there. And we had one battery run radio. And the choice of program was dictatorially decided by Link. And it was either the Red Sox or a comedy duo known as Bob and Ray,
Yeah.
who came out of Boston, I think, and they were just humorous and funny. But we would sit there with the gas lanterns going and the battery radio on and talk for hours. But I learned a lot from Lincoln in those evenings. He was an extraordinary guy.
Thank you, Sam. And any other comments from John, Dick, and Vin? Because I'd kind of like to open it up to comments from folks who have relationships with Mayhew, questions for, well, I don't want to call you a council of elders, but a bunch of guys who've been around a while.
So one thing that I noticed as I was looking at the names, and if you didn't mention Barty Bartholomew, who was the original trustee of Pasquaney and founder of the Yale Glee Club, among other things. But he was a trustee for 48 years. Pasquaney. Owen Lindsay was a trustee for 50 years. Ted Church and John Spaeth were both trustees for 30 years. So
And,
it was a bunch of dedicated people that were involved in the founding.
and of course, Owen was am I right that Owen was the first the chair of the Mayhew board, or the
Yes.
chair of this group? And
Yeah.
and when I showed up on the scene, Owen was already just this venerated founder figure, and one of the kindest human beings I ever met.
Wonderful man, wonderful.
Yeah.
And his
He
son
was really
was,
my mentor being involved with Mayhew. And I
Hi-
overlapped with him a little on the board.
Yes,
his
and
son
Vinny,
was the liaison between Pasquaney and Mayhew in that first summer. And he would take Pasquaney boys out to work on the island, and also, side by side with the Mayhew campers. And one of the things that Owen Jr. reported that they loved, all the Mayhew guys and the Pasquaney guys, and were fascinated by, was the ropes course. So that rope course focus was there right at the beginning, and that may be something that John can speak more to, where that came from.
and John will be mad at me because I say we want to save something for the next time, right?
Yeah. Let me just say parenthetically, a lot of my good friends were very, very involved in Outward Bound. And that's where the ropes course came from.
Monica, can we just ask anybody who wants to ask a question, should they unmute themselves and just pop in?
Yeah, I think unmuting and popping in. And since I'm unmuted and popped in, I'm going to ask a question.
Go.
So my question is, those of you who were there that first summer and before, would you have envisioned what you saw in the 6-minute video before we started this?
I'll start by saying, on one level, no, but when I watched the video just a little while ago, it made me think of the Groton School Camp. So the answer is, on one level, no, but on the other level, absolutely.
John?
I think I made a remark when there was a big dinner, a year ago, we had the big dinner. And I think I said to the crowd that I just wanted to salute everyone who made a dream that I had possible. It was just so far beyond what I dreamt of, but it was close. And it was a real salute to all those people that made this the wonderful, wonderful operation it is now. And it's fun hearing some of the history and some of the great people that got it going.
Maybe I have a question for you, John. It seems to me as though, and Sam as well, it seems like nobody owned a particular idea around the founding of Mayhew. It sounded very collaborative, that there were people coming from different places, and good ideas stuck, but it wasn't so much like one person's idea winning over another. I mean, what was going on there?
Well, one thing I would say is that and John will have more about the people, but I think we all saw the island, that is an island in a beautiful lake, as an opportunity to do things that would have been much harder to do if you had been on the mainland somewhere, outside of Manchester, outside of Concord or something like that. The island was a significant factor, and it isn't, it is significant that when the Webster family felt that at Groton Island and Squam, things are a little noisy, it was fascinating that they found another island. They could have found 50 acres of land somewhere in New Hampshire or Maine, but they didn't. They chose an island. So I think the island is very important, because what you're doing is you're taking young people, let's just say, out of a metropolis, out of an urban area, and putting them into an island where dreams can actually happen. So I think the island's very important.
Another element that I discovered in my research, and again, John, I think this may have been a collaboration of you and Mr. Charlie, is that even though they couldn't afford it in those first years, the idea of following the boys through the year was already there. And the funds weren't there yet. But in the documents, there's mention of the importance of maintaining that connection through the year. And John, do you have any memory of how that took shape?
I'm trying to recall that when Charlie came up to Bowdoin, the Visconti people had already given it a lot of thought. And I think that was one of the things that he put on the table. He said, here's what we're looking for. And I'd also like to come back to what Sam just said. The island is so much a part of the history of that organization and what it made happen. Unbelievable.
Yeah, can I add to that, Alan?
Sure. Hello, Warren.
Warren Cook. I was a counselor for a couple of years. Mr. Avery used to take us up every Memorial Day to help get the opening of the camp started. And it was a good opportunity for us to get off campus, which we were never allowed to do in those days. And he really impressed upon me the kind of the way to carry out the service ethic. And we got pretty close to that camp the 2 years that I was up there. I think it was my freshman and sophomore year for probably a month. And the island was just a special, special place, but also Avery and Bill Polk really trained us to serve and do the kind of job that we needed to do. And, that never went away, as Choate knows. I ended up back at Groton teaching after I got back from Vietnam. And, Frank White, as Choate said, was busy with Upward Bound. But one of the things I did that year, 2 years that I was back at Groton, I took my wife up to the camp, which was, I guess, I can't remember. I don't think it was open then, but I wanted her to see it because the island was such a neat place for me. And it was nice to see Sam Chauncey here. His father and was one of my classmates was Sam's brother, Don, and Bill were both good friends. And they had that Groton school camp thing in the conversation all the 6 years that I was at Groton. So, and then you had Avery looking after you, and Polk and Choate, he was a little bit younger, but he was one of my heroes when I was there. And then I ended up teaching with him. So it was kind of an infectious thing. And I've, as Alan and Jim know, I've stayed connected in one way or other ever since then. In fact, I ran a company in Merrimack, New Hampshire, and one of our plant managers, Armin Gagnon, who was an old Manchester boy, became one of the Mayhew trustees for a number of years, actually, until he died. And it's been great for me to follow it, and very interesting to hear you guys talk about some of that transition history.
Wow.
So thank you for including us.
Thanks for being here, Warren, and thanks for all your support of Mayhew through the years and that testimonial. Other thoughts or comments? Questions?
A thought I've often had was I wish Charlie Stanwood could see what Mayhew has become.
One little detail that people might be interested in is that when the Mayhew Council the first year went down to get those 10 boys in Manchester, they were seen off by the mayor of Manchester. That this was really seen as an exciting thing, and and important enough that the mayor showed up.
That's good.
I have a couple of comments.
Hello, David Lincoln.
Hello, Helen Cantor. Just going way back, Endicott Peabody in 1890 was the head of Groton School. Endicott Peabody read some articles by a reporter down in New York City named Jacob Reese. Jacob Reese was talking about the squalor of the Lower East Side. So Endicott Peabody, who was running a school for rich kids, saw the opportunity to bring some of the poor kids out of the Boston diocese and give them the Arnold experience. So I think what is interesting to me is that this started with a combination of very wealthy, grotty counselors and very poor kids from Somerville and Dorchester, and it transformed then Camp Pasquaney, which was a very successful camp for wealthy children, taking over and preserving the ideals of Endicott Peabody and the Groton School program. I think this has been terrific, and thank you.
David, it's great to see you. And something that we realized just the minute before we went on the air, we think this is true. We're going to say it's true, that the two longest serving faculty members at the Groton School were Endicott Peabody, the rector who founded the school and who started the Groton School Camp in the 1890s on Squam Lake, and Jonathan Choate, who's been with us tonight, who was the first director of the modern Mayhew. So let's hear it for longevity and for the vision of these two men to get these two programs together. I am looking at the clock, and I don't know if there's a final comment from any of the panelists before we move on.
So Al, just a little piece of trivia you were going to share with folks, or Sam can share. Who was the young attorney that signed our paperwork in the beginning?
That was a man who I ran his first political campaign. He wanted to be a state senator in New Haven, Connecticut. And in return for that, I used him as also to help him financially. I used him as my lawyer. And when we came to signing the papers, I had to get a lawyer, I guess, to attest to it. And his name was Joseph Lieberman, later United States Senator.
And nearly the Vice President of the United States.
Nearly the Vice President.
And he's on the original documents where Pasquaney gave, where Groton School gave the land to Mayhew. Is that correct?
Yeah.
All right. So Monica, my understanding is that we're going to hang in if people want to stay and chat for a social half hour. We could.
Yes, and I'll stop recording at that point.
I will. I do want to take sort of at the end of this sort of formal part of our presentation. I encourage everybody who wants to chat to hang out, like we're in the lodge and the boys are asleep and we got into the cookies and the milk. But I want to do a couple of things. I want to thank Monica and Jim and the staff at Mayhew for organizing this, because it's just been a hoot. I want to thank, of course, Sam and John and Vin and Dick for being part of this very special night and being part of, you're telling history, but now you're part of history, so people will be able to refer to this. And I want to thank everybody who loves Mayhew, who supports Mayhew. Everyone from, I see you, Dave Lincoln, when you were out there when you were a little boy, and you're still part of it. You're not quite a little boy anymore. People who've spent their whole life connected to it, or somebody who was maybe out there for 4 weeks and it changed their lives. And people who've been counselors, and there are a lot of staff alumni here and Groton alumni, and a lot of donors and trustees. This organization relies on your support, our support, So everybody who does whatever they can to keep this vision of Mr. Charlie and Jon Choate and Sam and Owen Lindsay and Paul Avery and these founding fathers of this remarkable institution, and of course Howard Lincoln and all that he did. All of you are keeping that going for the benefit of future generations. So thank you for all that you do on behalf of Mayhew. So I think Monica, I'll turn it over to you. We're kind of gonna, so thank you everybody, and we'll move into the more informal part of our time.
Yes, so as Al said, anybody who wants to just stay, you know, the next one is on the 11th of March, same time, and we're going to have Bill Barrick and Jon Choate, and Al will be our host again, and you're going to really find out about that first summer. And if anyone has any ideas of things they'd like to see in this kind of format, we're going to be home for a while. And this is great because you don't have to, you know, you can do this in your slippers. So send your ideas and we'll make it happen. But I'm going to turn off the recording now and then we can just visit. Thank you, Al.